Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here this afternoon. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute. And we are delighted to have with us Gerardo Maldonado and David Crow, two of the authors of this report on Mexico, the Americas, and the World, 2004 to 2014. I have been reading and have been consulted in this survey a number of times over the past decade or so. And I have to say it's been an incredible project to follow as an outsider, to see how Mexican public opinion has been adjusting, modified over this period of time, which has been a crucial period of time in Mexican history, of course. Many people would associate it with the period of democratization, but I see it very much as a period in which Mexico has opened up to the world. And not just economically speaking, but in terms of opening up its society. The process of globalization has really been felt throughout this period. And the internationalization of Mexico would lead you to believe that Mexicans have becoming more, feeling more comfortable with the world and more understanding of how the world matters to Mexico and how Mexico matters to the world. And we'll see some of that in the presentation that David and Gerardo are going to give us in a little while. But it's not always a linear progression, which I think is one of the most interesting things. And we see this particularly when we get to the relationship with the United States of America. The relationship with the United States of America, even as it has become deeper and far more integrated in economic and social terms, is one in which you see certain periods of rechazo, of rejection on the part of Mexican public opinion, and then you see a period of rapprochement happening. And what's particularly interesting about this survey, and I urge you to look for it, is the difference between the Mexican public in general and Mexican leaders. Leaders in terms of intellectual, political, economic, business leaders. It's very, very interesting to see the divergence that occurs at certain times, and including in the latest figures, which are in this survey from 2014, 2015, to see how the Mexican public in general is different from Mexican leadership. So I urge you to not only to listen to the presentation and to participate in the Q&A, but to take a look at the report itself, because it provides fascinating insights into the way in which Mexicans actually do see the world. So who's going to kick off? David, will you, or Gerardo? Gerardo, over to you, my friend.
Good evening, good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. This is really a pleasure for us, and also a great opportunity to show our data and discuss the results and receive also comments and insights to improve, because we are going to do this for a new round. We want really to thank also the Ambassador James Johnson and Anthony Wayne to be here to present and be part of this presentation. As Duncan has already mentioned, I will say it again. This has been now a long project. It started in 2004, and now we are going to present data for the decade, 2014, and this year is going to be our fifth development. It's going to be in September, I hope, so we will have now information from 2004 to 2016. In 2008, it started in Mexico, and then we spread to another Latin American countries. And now, in the last wave, we included information. We were able to include information from Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia. So what we see here, you will find also information very similar to these other countries. Also, Duncan mentioned that this is a particular project, not only because it's the only one in Mexico and in Latin America focused on foreign relations, foreign policy, international politics, but also we have two different samples. It's a national population sample, 2,400 interviews, and also we have a sample of Mexican leaders in 5 sectors: the government, politicians, entrepreneurs, civil society, and academics, and media. So what we show you is information from these two samples. I'm saying that because Mexico, the Americas, and the world now is separated to do different kinds of analysis, and we invite you to do. First is to compare across time. You can also compare results from different samples, I mean, population and leaders, and which is not always what has been done. You can also compare the results between countries, I mean, across countries. And also, we have information comparing different questions. And as you will see, there is important how we asked citizens, because that depends. The results and the answers will depend basically on that. A couple of things more. Now we have interviewed more than 37,000 people. 15,000 is just in Mexico. We have more than 300 items for the last 10 years in Mexico. So we have very good information about, let's say, the social basis of foreign policy and international politics in Mexico. What we will show you here is just very few part of these results. Some part of this, and this is also a small part of the huge, the important results that we have been reporting and analyzing. I'm going to start showing you what are the preferences and the basis of foreign policy in Mexico, I mean, based on Mexican opinions. Then we will focus more on the Mexican views of the US and the bilateral relation between Mexico and the United States. And then a part that we have called opportunities and challenges of the foreign policy. The first one, Mexicans and foreign policy. We have been asking the first thing that perhaps can explain policy preferences in terms of international relations and foreign policies, the contact of individuals and the world. So we asked the very first contact whether people has traveled abroad or not. And these are the results. And you can see in this graph the percentage of people that has never been abroad, I mean that zero travels abroad, it has been growing. It starts in the 67%, and now it's almost 80% of people saying that they had never been abroad in the country. That is the opposite. I mean, leaders, as you expected, have a better record of traveling abroad. Nevertheless, it has been going down. I mean, we started in 84%, and in the last wave of surveys, a little bit more than half of the leaders interviewed. Then, if we have, this is then we have the mean. I mean, the percentage. I mean, the mean of this number of traveling abroad. As you can see, for the national population, the average is two travels abroad. But if you look at the different characteristics of this national sample, you will find also important information. First, that people living in the north has a better records of traveling abroad. Then population living in urban location, men more than women, people over 50 years old, and also, which is really not surprising, people with university or more education has a better average of traveling abroad. In terms of the leaders, as you can see, it's almost 30 trips abroad, but that is really different between these 5 different sectors. And as you can see here, businessmen tend to be the more that used to go abroad Mexico. That's almost 44 travels abroad, but government and politicians are around only 20 travels. Second, we ask how much the war affect, and how much the war affect in personal life and in Mexico. We want to know if that makes some difference, and as you can see here, actually for Mexicans, there is a difference. I mean, the war affects more the country, I mean Mexico, than daily life of these individuals. And it is also similar what the national population and the leaders have said that. So they has a good record that people think that the war affects a little bit more the country than their own daily life. Then we know the contact, we also know how much the war affects. Now, whether Mexicans want to participate or not in the war. And as you can see here, more than 60% of national population said they wanted an active participation of Mexico in the war. And more than 90% of these leaders want an active participation of Mexico in the world. So they also want to be Mexico part, an active part of in the world. Then we ask how important should be different objectives of the foreign policy. Here you can see the results from the national population, and the first and most important people saying that it's percentage of saying very important. These objectives are first term, protecting the environment, then fighting drug trafficking and organized crime, and then promoting Mexican culture and interests of Mexican abroad and the sale of Mexican products. So people are interested in a foreign policy focused on their personal well-being and the well-being related also with that. If you can see down, there is less importance in terms of strengthening the United Nations or bringing foreign investment and the typical international security issues like fighting international terrorism or preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. The story is not very different from leaders. Actually, for them, the most important objectives are, again, protecting the environment and fighting drug trafficking. Then a little bit less is protecting the interests of Mexican and promoting sales of Mexican. Now, the less important ones are fighting terrorism and strengthening the United Nations. So this is a story about the importance of the foreign policy for the personal or the national well-being is also the same for population and leaders. Then, which instruments the Mexicans want to use in order to influencing the world? And what Mexicans want to use is normal, what we could say, soft-powered instruments and not hard-powered instruments. That means that Mexicans agree with using trade, culture, international cooperation, and diplomacy as instruments to influencing the world. This is a similar story for more support in terms of the leader. But if you can see at the bottom of this graph, Mexicans disagree with the use of military power in the world, and this is very strong specifically for leaders. Only 15% of leaders say they can use military power or that they agree with using military power. In terms of the national population, it's a little bit more than 45%. So Mexicans want to use, again, just soft-powered instrument, not hard-powered instrument, more peaceful society. Then, in terms of economic openness, as you can see, for Mexicans, foreign investment is very much or somewhat beneficial for the country. In terms, almost 90% of leaders agree that foreign investment is bring benefits to Mexico. And in terms of free trade, you have the percentage of the people believing that it has that free trade has been good for different things. In first term, it's Mexican economy, then the standards of living of people, then Mexican agriculture, and in least places the environment. So Mexicans are open to the world, and they differentiate how are the benefits from different sectors. Then identity, how it is also behind this. And as you can see here, there is at least here is a clear difference between the national population, current Mexican, and the leaders. First thing, the Latin American identity has been decreasing in the last decade. And in that sense, also the, let's say, cosmopolitan identity, being or feeling a citizen of the world has been growing in national population, but that is the opposite, or it is not the same story for the leaders. Leaders tend to be more Latin Americanist and then citizens of the world, but it has been changed. It's grown 10 percentage points in the last years. And then the other part of this story, or the other part of this graph, is that the natural or the closest regions, North America and Central America, has not developed any kind of identity among Mexicans, not even with NAFTA has been used then. But what about actually preferences in terms of regional importance? And as you can see here, for leaders, the story is very clear. They wanted to a little bit more preference for Latin America than North America, but people has been changing. I mean, there are a couple of years where, 2008, 2014, where they prefer, or we preferred Latin America, but in 2010 and 2012, we preferred Latin America. So it's more volatile and or unstable, this preference. But the other thing is that population, or the national population, just focus in this continent, not in other, not Europe or not Asia. And in terms of leaders, they have at least a little bit more open view, and there is some percentage, at least 80% in 2014, that they wanted to Mexico be focused more on Asia than any other regions. Then in terms of national and regional integration, and as I told you, we can compare between questions. And we ask Mexicans to give whether they agree or disagree with different actions in terms of regional integration. But for half of the population, we ask about these actions, but related with Latin America integration. And then we ask the other half of the population asked between North American integration. We expect it to be a little bit different because they're not the same mechanisms, are not the same regions, but as you can see here, actually the preferences for both North America and Latin America are actually very similar. I mean, Mexicans want to be integrated, whether North or South, in the same way. I mean, they prefer, in first place, more roads and bridges, then free circulation of investment and free flows of services and goods. Then more, just a little bit more than half of the population, just a common foreign policy and joint embassies with Latin America and North America, and in the least place is joint military operation, whether with Latin America or with North America. The only action of regional integration where people, and the Mexicans, wanted a little bit more integrated with North America than with Latin America, it's currency. So that would be same currency for the North America. In terms of the let's say the order of these preferences are very much the same. Then the relations with specific relations with different countries. We ask whether people think that our relations with these countries are the same, is that a friends, partner, rivals, or threat? As you can see, in terms of this, Brazil, for Mexicans, Brazil is mostly a friend. China is mostly a partner. Then Cuba, mostly a friend for national population and for leaders. Then the United States, for Mexicans, it's clear that the United States is more a partner than a friend. Then Guatemala is also a friend of Mexico. And Venezuela for population is also a friend. And for leaders, there is the third part, they consider Venezuela as a friend. But if you can see, this is the only percentage where threat is more than 20%. So there is part of the leaders that consider Venezuela as a threat of Mexico. But in general terms, as you can see, we have very nice Latin American friends, and the most important two economies, the United States and China, are good partners of Mexico. Then Mexican views of the US and the bilateral relation. First, we ask at least the opinion, the numerical opinion of 25 countries. But first we make the average of these countries in terms of regions. And as you can see here, the North America is the region in the world where Mexicans have the most value. Then it's Europe, and then Asia Pacific. After that comes the Latin American regions. I mean, Central America, the Andean region, and the Southern part. And the least place is the Middle East. So Mexicans really value countries in the North American part of the world. Well, what we did also were asked about countries in the new groups and the new international mechanisms of development. We asked about the countries of the BRICS. We also asked the countries about MICTA and the Pacific Alliance, because Mexico now is part of the new mechanisms. There are two results here. First, Mexican prefers the BRICS than our mechanisms, MICTA and Pacific Alliance, but these mechanisms have not a better opinion than North America, so North America are the winners for this. Let's see how this looks in terms of country. For population, as you can see in in a numerical opinion from 0 to 100, the USA is the country who has a better record. I mean, 67 points. For leaders, it's Germany, but the US comes in third place after Germany and Canada and United Kingdom. Public has not a very good opinion about Iran and Israel, and leaders has a very bad opinion, or at least bad opinion for Venezuela and Iran. Then we ask not only about countries, but also leaders. And as you can see here, for the public national population, our favorite leader is the Pope Francis, then Barack Obama. But for leaders, our most popular, most favorite leader is Michelle Bachelet, President of Chile, then Pope Francis, then Dilma Rousseff, and then Barack Obama. Just one anecdote there. When we showed this result to actually Michelle Bachelet last visit in Mexico, she said that she preferred to be president of Mexico and not Chile. We have a better opinion of her. Do you want to follow from here?
Sure. Great. I'm going to take over and talk a little bit more about the relationship between Mexico and the United States. Before I do, however, I would like to say that Gerardo's has been director of the Mexico, the Americas and the World survey, the Americas and the World Global Project for the past year. It's far too modest to say it. I'm grateful that he allowed me to tag along for this presentation, and also to recognize with gratitude the presence of Diana Negro Ponte here with us today. In addition to her many achievements in law and public service, she's on the Wilson board, and I have to say that in my experience, it's not as common as it should be for board members to take an active interest in the activities of the groups they're involved in. So we're very grateful for your presence with us today, and it's an incentive for us. It really is. Okay.
You get my question.
Right.
Well, we welcome challenging questions. It keeps us on our toes, right? Okay. So this is the evaluation of countries, different countries across time. You can see that the green line at the top of the public, the sort of dark green line is the United States, and it's really fluctuated over time. It peaked in 2006, then plummeted in 2008, and has climbed gradually back up since then, arriving at another sort of local peak in 2012, and then declining slightly since then. So I had speculated that that had to do with my arrival in Mexico in 2010, but Gerardo assures me that it's not that. It's probably an Obama effect. Spain, probably, yeah. Spain also has that sort of humped trajectory, peaking in 2008 and declining then. It's this second line there. Brazil has, on the other hand, gone up. It's the kind of teal line in the middle of the graph on the left-hand side. And that also seems to have followed Brazil's trajectory in the international stage. So coming up, valleys and peaks and sort of now on downward. Interestingly, the Latin American countries, Chile is most favorably rated, and then Cuba and Guatemala are kind of at the bottom of the chart. And if you look on the right, the rank order is more or less the same, but Spain has gone down amongst leaders, and the United States has sort of gone back up. It's risen to its initial level. Feelings toward the United States. This is, I think, kind of encouraging for the Americans, we Americans who care about what people in the world think of us. And we can see that on the left, we have, on the top two graphs, we have the public's feelings, Mexican public's. It's the general survey amongst the 2,400 respondents. So distrust, which is the maroon line, peaked in 2008 and it's gone down. And in mirror fashion, trust, well, not exactly mirror fashion, I guess. Trust has gone up steadily from about 20% to 44%. Now it's at 44% trust, 36% distrust. Um, on the right, we have the question of whether Mexicans admire or disdain the United States more. Admiration, again, is now at 49%, and disdain is at 14%. So I guess if we were to put it in the language of the US presidential campaign, the positives are high and the negatives are low, right? And we see broadly the same tendencies among Mexican leaders. Again, trust and distrust fluctuating, but trust is 50 to 45%, so a net positive of 5. And admiration has always been high among the leaders, and disdain low, 62 to 12%. The interesting thing is, although the positives are net higher now, that the feeling of admiration has always kind of been there, while the trust has been fluctuating but come up. So Mexicans certainly admire the United States for many of the characteristics we have, and we have a slide later that will show what exactly is sort of behind that admiration. But they haven't always trusted the United States. This is a really kind of interesting question. Which country do you trust most to keep the world peace? And we asked this about the 5 members of the United Nations Security Council. And we can see that China is net negative, though less so over time. The United States starts out with a net negative, but becomes increasingly positive. France and Great Britain have always been positive, but have gone down. And Russia is always negative and becoming more negative. So the United States seems to be increasing sort of at the expense of France and Great Britain. So more good news for Americans who care what Mexicans think about us. This is a general question that we have. It's what we call institutional or political trust. We asked, how much do you trust the following institutions or people? And we have about, I think, 16 or so altogether. Again, the top part of the graphic is leaders. No, I'm sorry, public, and the bottom part of the graphic is leaders. The church is far and away the most trusted institution for the Mexican public. This is from the 2014-2015. So we're talking that this was a survey was done in December of 2014, November of 2014 to January of 2015, right? But the rank order has remained fairly stable over time. And perhaps to the surprise of nobody, the police and politicians are the least trusted institutions. Interestingly, the Mexican president and judges are less trusted than the U.S. government. So Mexicans trust the U.S. government more than they trust their own president and judges. Kind of in the middle of the table would be human rights organizations, both local human rights organizations and international ones, and the United Nations. For the leaders, we see that there's clearly a greater internationalist bent, right? The international human rights organizations are most trusted. The UN's up there. And the trust of the U.S. government is, again, middle of the table. But if we compare, 56% of leaders trust the U.S. government a lot or somewhat. And that figure for the public is only 37% who trust the U.S. government a lot or somewhat. So of the public, more people distrust the U.S. government than trust it. And amongst leaders, more people trust it than distrust it. Now, this is kind of a fun question. We ask, how much would you agree to Mexico and the United States becoming a single country if it improved your standard of living? Now, I had personally not been a fan of this question until we had a long conversation with our founding director, Guadalupe Gonzalez, who was here with us last time we presented in the Wilson Center. And she said, of course, this is not talking about a real proposal that anyone's on the U.S. or the Mexican side is seriously discussing. But what it really measures is how much would Mexicans be willing to trade away their sovereignty if it increased their material standard of living, right? So it's sort of a material well-being versus national sovereignty trade-off. And the interesting part is is that in 2012 and 2014, more Mexicans would be in favor of this proposal than against it. 53% in favor versus 44% against. The donut graph on the right sort of breaks it out. And of the against, it's really polarized. So we have sort of this nationalist readouts of like 39% of the people are strongly, if you're against it, you're strongly against it, right? And I'm not quite sure what to make of that, other than I think that there's just this kind of desperation almost right now in Mexico. I'd be interested in hearing Gerardo's take on this, but of almost anything if we could get the standard of living up, right? Quality of life. So that would include, I think, material well-being, but also security, right? Now, this is a fun question too, which is, in your opinion, how important on a 7-point scale? Sorry, this is a 4-point scale. Very important, somewhat important, not very important, or not at all important. So how important is each of these characteristics to your sense of what it is to be Mexican, right? So this is the percentage of people who said very or somewhat important. We're combining those two categories. And both leaders and public for the sort of top ones, it's very important to feel national pride, right? That's the most important one. To respect national symbols like the flag and the national anthem is also very important. To be fluent in Spanish is also. So there's this kind of modernizing liberal identity in which to be part of the Mexican national family, you have to speak Spanish. So that would kind of exclude, maybe indigenous speakers or speakers of foreign languages. To have been born in Mexico is also really important. So there's this sense that of the jus suel, right? And so you have to have been born in Mexico for other Mexicans to consider you really Mexican, right? To be able to be willing to fight in the Mexican army is also really important. But then the things that are not so important, I think, to me, are more interesting. So, for example, to prefer Mexican movies and popular culture over foreign culture. And anyone who's been to Mexico knows that, or really anywhere in the world, U.S. popular culture has this amazing capacity to project itself. Leaders reject that, but the public, 67% of the public accepts that, right? Catholicism is also an important element of the national identity for 60% of the public, but only 25% of leaders. And the most interesting thing, I think, for this purpose of this presentation is we had this one kind of awkwardly phrased, admittedly, to not be supportive of the not support the United States, right? So this was not an important element. So opposing the United States was not an important element of Mexicans' national identity. What this means is that Mexican nationalism, I think, is sort of an inclusive nationalism. We like Mexico, it's a great country, but not because other countries are worse or bad, but we like other countries too. We can be Mexican and secure in our identity enough to also appreciate what other nations have to offer. And that's, I think, a really important lesson of this survey, is that Mexican nationalism is an inclusive one. Okay, we're almost done. This is also a really great slide. I say that because it's a project that I'm involved in, but so this is what Mexicans like about the United States. And this is actually a question that Gerardo developed and put on the survey because of his interest in studying sort of the roots of anti-Americanism. And some of what people don't like about America has to do with what it does. And other parts of what people potentially dislike about America is what it is, who we are as a country. And if we see that what America is pretty popular. It's on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is very negative and 7 very positive. How do you rate each of the following aspects of the United States, right? So the scientific and technological advances is really high. Popular culture is pretty high. Position as the most important country in the world. The democracy is pretty high. Remember, 4, on the scale of 1 to 7, 4 is the midpoint. So anything above 4 is positive, and the closer you are to 7 is the higher you are. So our American democracy is 5.0 out of 7. Not bad. Promotion of free trade. So the bottom half of the table, though, is more things America does, right? So the American military presence in the world isn't as appreciated as, for example, the United States' scientific and technological advances. And the things that are least liked about America are two things that the U.S. does, which is the war on terror and the defense and promotion of democracy in the world. This is, I think, seen through the lens of Mexican nationalism as kind of intrusive, right? U.S. economy, this is how much the economy has gotten better or worse. Interestingly, this is 2014, so the recovery has kicked in, but Mexicans aren't feeling it yet. 5% said much worse, 26% said worse, 28% said the same. So we're talking, what is that? 50 something percent, over 50% that says the same or worse, right? Duncan had an interesting suggestion when I was talking to him now, and he said, well, why don't we compare this with remittance receipts? And I think that's a wonderful suggestion, which unfortunately didn't have time to do for this presentation since it was like 5 minutes. 2 years' time. Well, we didn't talk to you soon enough, did we? We need to clearly we need to consult with him more frequently. But so it would be interesting, I think, to see how much remittance. We actually looked this up in his office. I think that remittance were at their height around 2007 when it was around $30 billion. They fell to around 19 billion in around, I don't know, 2010, and they're back up around 24 billion now. So they're shooting back up, but haven't quite reached their previous height. Relations between Mexico and Guatemala, the United States and Cuba. So we have public's evaluations on the left, 69%, I can't quite read that, it's 72% positive with Guatemala, a much higher percent positive with the United States, and then with Cuba as well. So Mexicans tend to evaluate their relationships with, we picked these three countries because they share boundaries. In the case of Cuba, maritime boundary with Mexico. They think that the relations with their neighbors are, by and large, good, right? This is what is the most important aspect of the bilateral relationship. In both cases, it was migration, although slightly higher. The public is green and the leaders are blue. Slightly higher, migration was judged to be a slightly more important aspect of the relationship with the United States than with Guatemala. And the second most important with the United States is trade. That's that second pair of bars on the lower graph. But for Guatemala, the border relationship. As you know, this has become really important with all the Central American transmigrants. And there's this sort of movement afoot to perhaps institute greater controls at the borders. Opportunities and challenges. Will be really brief. I think another couple of slides here. The top line, it shows that the number of survey respondents that report having relatives that live outside Mexico has declined from 61 to 45%. This is the United States. 97% of Mexicans who live abroad do so in this country. So contrary to a lot of the rhetoric that we're hearing in the presidential campaign now, it's not a country that's being overrun by Mexican migrants. As you know, they're going back, right? Interestingly, though, the middle line there is that 29% of those relatives abroad were former household members, people that had lived in the same house as the survey respondent. That number went up to 34%. So it's sort of fewer people, but concentrated in the same households, right? So it's a sort of strengthening of migrant networks. The number of people who report having lived in a foreign country and having received money is also going down. We can skip that slide. This is just general knowledge. We asked, do you know the name of the President of the United States? Do you know the name of the governor of your state? So 77% of the Mexicans can name the president of the United States. Makes sense. It's an important country for all Mexicans. 71% can name the governor of the state. Only 4% can name the Secretary of Foreign Affairs in Mexico. I should say that the Foreign Ministry is a major sponsor of our survey, and they didn't really care for. They insisted that we put it on, but so we gave them the information. But again, people know what they need to know, right? I mean, in some sense, maybe the governor of your state or the president of the United States is much more relevant than the name of the Secretary of the Foreign Ministry, right? Return migration is an increasingly important topic in Mexico. So this is, sorry, this is not return migration. This is another slide. This is immigration. So out migration from Mexico to the United States. Do you believe that the U.S. has made it very difficult, easy, or very easy for Mexicans to enter the United States? 43% say very difficult. Only 6% say very easy. So the perception in Mexico, not unfounded in the facts, I would say, is that it's gotten much more difficult to come to the United States. This is the return migration. So how easy has it been to remake your life or rebuild your life in Mexico? Is the upper left-hand one. 7% says very easy, 36% easy, 20% neither easy nor difficult. So people are not having a difficult time reincorporating themselves into Mexican society when they go back. The donut graph essentially says that there's very much or somewhat in agreement that the Mexican government has a responsibility towards these return migrants in terms of helping them find work, right? And then finally, we asked, do Mexicans believe that return migrants weaken customs and traditions? Most people reject that. That they foster insecurity. Most Mexicans don't think that the return migrants are contributing to security problems. Most people think that return migrants are bringing innovative ideas. Most people reject the idea that return migrants are taking away jobs from Mexicans. So they don't see these return migrants as a source of competition in labor markets. And finally, most Mexicans think that return migrants are contributing to the economy. So when Mexicans return to Mexico after having lived abroad, there's this overwhelmingly positive perception of them. Finally, and these are the last couple of slides, we have a thermometer rating, which Gerardo already talked about in the context of different countries. So this is the U.S., right? Favorable feelings toward the U.S. on a scale of 0 to 100. The gray bar that says constant is kind of the baseline, right? So 67.5% is the average rating on this scale. If you've lived abroad without papers, undocumented, that number goes up about, 5 points, a little under 5 points to 72.2%. If you've lived abroad with papers, it's exactly the same. So the interesting thing is having lived here in the United States improves Mexicans' perceptions of the United States, and it doesn't matter if you had documents or not. I find that fascinating, right? On the right is a similar thing, also adding in if you have family members in the United States. So if you have family members in the States and you've lived in the States, your perception, positive perception goes up even higher. This is the same analysis, this one here, for the Obama meter. So this is the same 0 to 100 scale for Obama. Again, the gray is the baseline, right? If you've never lived in the US, you have a 65.4 perception of the US. Now, if you've lived abroad without papers, it's basically the same. If you've lived abroad with regular legal status, it goes up to 73.2%. This is positive perceptions of Obama. So for the U.S., perceptions of the U.S. as a country, legal status doesn't make a difference. It does make a very important difference, though, for perceptions of Obama. We think this is because of many sort of migration reform organizations talking about Obama as the deporter-in-chief. So there seems to be a very specific attribution of responsibility for deportations toward Obama but not necessarily towards the United States as a country. And this is just some information about the characteristics of the survey. And that wraps it up. It's time for questions and answers.
Thank you, David and Gerardo. Before we go to the Q&A, let me just, David was kind enough to recognize Diana Negroponte, but let me just also recognize Ambassador James Jones and Ambassador Tony Wayne, who are also with us here today, and it's been great to be able to work closely with you, and also be interesting to hear your feedback on how you see things have changed, perhaps, over the years in terms of this attitude. David, do you want to add something?
I did want to add something. If there's one thing you write down today, please write down that address, URL, web address. It's one of the characteristics of this project is that all the documentation, all the reports, all the data, the original data are available gratis online, courtesy of our sponsors in the Mexican government. So this is a treasure trove. Huh? And the American government, true. The American government, the U.S. Embassy funds us, and they contribute toward the printing of the reports in English. So it's a binational project, I guess we could say. Anyway, please do write down that address. This is a treasure trove of data, and part of our reason for being here today at the Wilson Center is to encourage people to exploit it. And of course, we're available for any sort of consultations that you have. Pass out our cards afterwards.
Thank you,
Sorry.
David. No worries at all. That's great. Before we open up for Q&A, I just want to make a couple of brief comments, things that I found intriguing. One was this question of the changing identity, the difference between leaders and the general population in terms of a Latin American identity. And I wonder if you could comment on that, as well as on the North American identity. The fact that it seems to be that the Mexican public is becoming less Latin American in identity, but Mexican leaders seem to be becoming more Latin American in identity. It's an intriguing phenomenon. Secondly, the joint military operations. I find that the numbers are quite low on that, and Dave and I were commenting on this beforehand, but it was somewhere in the 40% range. But if you put that in historic perspective, that may not actually be so bad. Given all of the conventions and customs of Mexican foreign policy about non-intervention abroad, and the fact that it's only recently that peacekeeping operations involving, or Mexican participation in peacekeeping operations has been authorized, that this is actually quite a respectable number in the sort of 40% range. And lastly, the relatives abroad and the thing that you began with, Gerardo, the trips abroad. It seems to me they're both tied to perhaps the economic cycle. And I wonder if you have some ideas about how the economic cycle ties directly or indirectly into Mexican attitudes about the world. And while you're digesting all of that, let's open up for questions from the audience. Who would like to come in? Please, sir, if you don't mind identifying yourself, and the microphone's right behind you.
Howard Woldridge with LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Because it came up so high in your survey in terms of what is troubling the Mexican population, Vicente Fox, this is on the issue of drug cartels, drug violence, etc. Vicente Fox has been an outspoken person in U.S., I assume all over North America, to highlight the fact that the American prohibition is causing so much pain, suffering, and death in Mexico, especially in the 6 northern states. So my question is, and until a few years ago in the U.S., anyone speaking of changing the strategy of drug prohibition, war on drugs, was pretty much out in the wilderness. My question is, because the American prohibition impacts so much more the 6 northern states of Mexico, is Vicente Fox also a voice in the wilderness, or is he actually being listened to and saying, hey, this guy may have an idea worth exploring?
Thank you. And a question right here. Nobody else has a question right now? Ah, there we go. One over here. Always takes that awkward moment before somebody says, okay, fine, I've got a question.
Hi, Jose Burnes. I'm a scholar at Dartmouth College. So I have just 2 quick questions. One is, do you think, because this is based on 2014, do you think there's going to be a significant difference if you make a prediction on Trump's comments or just like the general overview? Like, what do you think would be most impacted? And secondly, this is in terms of methodology, because I'm curious to see if there is any sort of mode bias, or how did you conduct your survey in Mexico? Did you overrepresent or underrepresent certain populations? Because I figure I don't know the specific numbers of people that have internet access, of people that have phone access, but the way that you conducted your survey, how'd you control for that, I guess, is my second question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Answer some of the questions, or would you prefer
You
to
mean
collect
you
them?
don't want to just store it all up? Yes, of course.
know,
Please,
but-
why don't you take this, and then where people will perhaps react to that with some more questions.
All right, I will start. First, about the Latin American and the cosmopolitan identity and the difference between that one, between population and public and the leader. What is behind? The honest question is I don't know, because I haven't done the analysis, but we have some hypotheses what is behind. First, there is first thing, there is a generational change. I mean, now it's a little bit people, younger generations tend to be more, have a better attached to the world, and they feel more citizen of the world. I mean, when you do the analysis of this question divided by different generations, you see that younger people tend to answer more the being citizen of the world, and in the contrary, older generations tend to feel more Latin Americans. And we have, and then I will back to the methodological question. So we have people from different ages in Mexico. That could be an answer. Also, the penetration of the internet. So people also connected or receiving information. We have that question. People that receive, what are the sources of information? We have television, we have printed media, radio, and also the internet. So people that is using the internet to get information, it's also people that tend to say that they feel more citizens of the world than any other. So that could be also behind, and it's also related with generation, so it's difficult to differentiate, but there is another, that is another hypothesis there. In the terms of leader, there our sample of leaders tend to be a little bit more similar among themselves. I mean, there is just the characteristic of the leader in terms of aging, in terms of education. So what this graph, I think, is measuring is that people is getting more close to the world, and then that kind of identity is developed. Why not the North America and the Central America and combined with the Latin America? I think that this can be also an effect of the national discourse or the discourse of some politicians. I mean, Mexico has been, for many, been distant from Latin America and more close to North America, at least for the population. I'm saying this because there is information for Peru. And when you graph this from Peru, it's exactly the opposite. I mean, they start feeling more citizens of the world and then Latin Americans, and then it has been actually the Latin American identity of Peruvians and Colombians is getting better. Why? Because now the last governments has trying to get more in touch with the Latin American regions and the Latin American with the Latin American neighbors. Mexico is not the same story. The joint military operation is not a bad result. I agree. Actually, it's not a bad result. And the thing is that we expected really to be different, to get a different result based on the integration of the Latin American integration and the North American integration. And what we see here is there is no difference, actually. People do not differentiate. They want that kind of action, whether it's Latin America or North America. And they are not opposed to the joint military operation with the Latin American country or with the United States and Canada. That could be also related. And when we actually can do that analysis, whether that is related with the peacekeeping operations, because we have some questions about the peacekeeping operation, whether Mexicans want to be part of that. And if you have been or you have seen the results of this survey and the previous surveys, actually Mexicans support the action that Mexico should be part of these peacekeeping operations. Then trips abroad. I think that the explanation should be also, we haven't done the analysis yet, but it has to do with the economic cycle. Definitely there is a relationship based on that. Do you want to say, please, go.
After you.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so there's a clear relation with the economic downturn in the United States, but there's also a relationship, I think, between having relatives abroad and trips abroad. We asked another question. We didn't report the results of that question in this presentation, but one of the main reasons that people go to live abroad or to travel abroad is to visit relatives they have here. So Mexicans are coming back, or I guess going back to Mexico, and their relatives in Mexico therefore have less an incentive to travel abroad. So those two things I think are related.
Yep. Do you want to follow?
Sure, and you can compliment. Howard Waldridge, that's a great question. And this is, I think, that's something Mexico, together with the former Colombian president, Gaviria, Cesar Gaviria, and Mujica de Uruguay, there's this sort of block of Latin American bloc in favor of decriminalization of drugs. And so moving away from this approach, the war on drugs, which is, I think, widely viewed to have failed. Now, in terms of Mexican public opinion, we did ask some questions in 2012 about preferences over a range of different drug policies. And at that time, support for decriminalization was about right in the middle of the scale. We think we asked it on a 7-point scale, and so this was right an average of 4. But it was the least favored policy in 2012, and at that time, most Mexicans seemed to support this kind of militarization of the war on drugs. Now that was 4 years ago. The good thing is, and this goes to Jose. I'm sorry I didn't catch your last name.
Burdes.
Great. Okay, thank you. Your question about if there would be differences in 2016. We're going to ask this set of questions again when we do the poll in a couple of months. And I think that's one area in which we will see change. But I also, my impression is, and it's just an impression until this is confirmed by the data, is that the political leadership is kind of ahead of public opinion on this one, and pulling it. But it's clear that there's a Latin American bloc in favor of kind of moving to a decriminalization and sort of medical treatment model of drugs, and that my sense is that it's pulling the public along with it, right? But we'll see. We'll get back with you when we're here next year, right? And this gets to, I think, Jose's question. Boy, no crystal ball, but I would be surprised if these sort of general ratings about the U.S. didn't go down. I mean, this anti-immigrant, this sentiment in general in the United States, and the Mexico has been a national group specifically singled out, right? It's dismaying to large swaths, generally to the Mexican public. So what will be interesting, though, is there seems to be this differentiation between personalities and the U.S. as a whole, and certain traits of the U.S. and certain actions of the U.S. So it will be interesting to see, I think, which parts are affected and which parts aren't affected. We will have a question specifically on this thermometers of Donald Trump. So that'll allow us to sort of tease out how, if there is sort of a decline in evaluations of the U.S., how much is due to Trump and how much is due to other things? Mode bias, another great question, Jose. This is all face-to-face surveys. So we specifically eschew doing phone or internet surveys precisely because of the lack of coverage. This makes it a very expensive survey to do, by the way. But we just, I guess our feeling in the survey team, and Gerardo can talk about this, but is that I think we're just not quite there yet in terms of the representativeness of internet panels Well, Pablo Parras is here. He's, in addition to being on the staff of the Mexican embassies, also the director of the company that does the survey for us, Data OPM. And I'd be interested in hearing what he says. But our impression is that it's just not there for either phone surveys. The coverage is you're going to miss out a lot of rural, and you're going to miss out a lot of sort of poorer people. So we do it face to face, and I think we're getting we really pay a lot, and we really work hard to get a representative survey.
Anything else, Gerardo, to add?
Do you want to comment?
Briefly, thanks. For phone, we don't have good enough sample frameworks because cellular phone is increasing, and we don't have good prefix to do any significant sample. And internet penetration has been increasing rapidly, but it's still about 50-some% of the population, and there's other methodological problems. So it's not because of the money, but it's in terms of robustness,
Yes.
you need to still do face-to-face in order to have a truly national representative sample.
There's a question right here and then one over here.
Yes, I'm Jose Diaz with Reforma newspaper. I think for those of us who are interested in the bilateral relation, we are eager to have a similar poll in the U.S. about opinions about Mexico, because I was recently trying to find something. I read your poll, and at least publicly, there's no similar kinds of polls related to countries. I think Gallup has a general poll on countries who are perceived as allies of the U.S., and contrary to what Mexicans perceive as, meanwhile, Mexicans perceive the U.S. as a top country rated in the world. Mexico is not rated as a true ally for many Americans. It's Great Britain and Canada are at the very top, followed by others, mostly from the from the Commonwealth. But what does it tell you that Mexico is perceived here in America as a second-tier ally? Meanwhile, for Mexicans, it's the U.S. is the most better rated country.
Is there a question?
Hello, I'm Lindsay, and I'm actually a student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I was just wondering, this is such an immense amount of information that you have collected, and I was just wondering what kind of action maybe you're hoping to see after collecting all this information, or how do you feel like this information will further affect maybe policy changes between Mexico and the United States?
Thank you. Chris?
Thanks. I just actually have one observation or comment to throw out there. I thought one thing that was fascinating was the difference in the issues, I forget the exact wording of the question, that were most important vis-a-vis the United States and vis-a-vis Guatemala. And the one thing that jumped out to me is this idea of how we understand borders versus migration issues. And for vis-a-vis the United States, migration was flagged as the top issue. And vis-a-vis Guatemala, it's borders, which seems to me to say something that, when people are entering our country, we perceive it as a border challenge, a challenge of how we manage our borders. And when people are leaving our country, we understand it as a migration issue that needs to be solved. And it's a fascinating, window into how we understand that, and maybe helps us understand as the United States why we see the issue as a border issue, whereas Mexicans see it as a migration issue.
Thank you. Yes, let's take one more.
Hi, my name's Sophia, and I'm from Arizona PBS. And I noticed when you were giving the statistics on the opinion of the country versus the opinion of Obama, you mentioned like the Obama effect. Could you explain that a little bit more?
So before we allow Gerardo and David to give their answer, let me just say, Jose, that we are working with the Chicago Council right now on a survey of U.S. attitudes towards Mexico and Mexicans that will come out in October sometime, okay? So it won't be nearly as grand a study as this. It's going to be a much more humble enterprise, but it'll give us some idea. And we did a similar survey 3 years ago with the Chicago Council. So if you drop me a line, I'll send you the link to that, the results of that survey. And just, if I may, I wonder if the whole allies question is actually, in the United States, allies means military, whereas in Mexico it means something else.
Should also mention, I think the Pew Center has done some work on how Americans view Mexico. So I would encourage you to check them out too, Pew Center. Be happy to, if you drop me an email, to point you to some of that stuff too. But
okay. First, Pepe's question. Thanks for being here, actually. You have the answer of the we don't have is actually what it is not available. It has been done, as far as I know, is a similar survey. And let me tell you in this sense, the first two waves of the survey, 2004, 2006, actually were made in alliance with the Chicago Council. And if you look at the questionnaire, the very first questionnaire is very similar to the American questionnaire in terms of the threats, in terms of alliance, but then we came up with results that there were not a good interpretation for Mexico, so we started changing from the original Chicago Council. And as Duncan already said, it has been now a new service. But there is nothing similar. I mean, most of our questions are focused on the Mexican views of the United States and the bilateral relation and the different. I mean, we have many more questions about that in not only 2014 but in previous waves of the surveys. It would be nice to have actually a similar survey. I mean, we would like in future to do the Americans on the World Survey here in the US, of course, and in Canada, if it's possible, to get not only about the views, but also views from two other regions compared to Latin American. I want to also to add that this morning, actually, we were at the Mexican embassy here in Washington, and we were discussing that we need not only a survey on Americans' opinions about Mexico and Latin America, but we need also the opinion of Mexicans living here and the Mexican Americans living here. So it will be, actually, I'm thinking, well, perhaps you're daydreaming, but we would like to have a really comprehensive survey. Not only that we have a sample of Americans, we need also a specific sample of Mexicans living here, and we need a specific sample of Mexicans America. And then we will have a real, more broad, a better picture of the idea of Mexicans and the bilateral relationship. There has been some stuff on that, but we don't have that project yet. And I know I have seen also the Gallup results, and I wrote a piece that I haven't published because I don't know why, but comparing, why? Because I don't get people angry, but is really, I don't know what is behind, but if you look just one graph, when you put the sentiments, Mexican sentiments to the United States and the American sentiments to Mexico, it's really the opposite. And as much as we love this country doesn't love you back, to put it in that way, actually. Then the question about the policy changes based on that. We don't have official records of that, but at least I can tell a couple of stories or anecdotes on that. First, we know from officials at the Secretary of Foreign Affairs in Mexico that we have this, as I mentioned, the opinions about peacekeeping operation and Mexico being part of that. We know that the decision of this government of being part of peacekeeping operation were made based on different information, but one piece of information was actually this result. They know that Mexicans support that decision. They were very reluctant to do it for some way, but when they see that it is not as Mexicans are supportive of that, but there has been constantly supporting of that, then they made a decision. They were not problems to do that. Of course, there are parts of a specific Mexican politicians that are still against that, but not national population and not the majority in leaders. Migration policy, immigration policy, actually, in Mexico. There is a new policy specifically for Central Americans in Mexico, and if you look at the results of the survey and then the southern frontier, the Frontera Sur program, it's really surprising that what they're doing is what Mexicans support. I disagree on that perhaps, but it is really in that way. And we have presented this also at the Mexican Congress and the Mexican Ministry, and people tend to, we have this kind of reactions. We know that I think it was 4 years ago when the Mexican Foreign Ministry went to speak with in the Congress, he used this information to make a good evaluation of the foreign policy. But then, in the question and answers section, the opposition parties use our survey to make critiques on that. So we know that we have a little bit some effects. And I said, I don't have good official records on that, but we know that it has been useful. Then the Obama effect, not the David Crow effect?
Not that yet, unfortunately. I would like to comment on Jose Diaz's. It's frustrating, isn't it? I mean, every time that it seems like the Mexico-U.S. bilateral relationship is going to come front and center, something happens. I remember, I think, with George W. Bush visited Fox before he even took office, and it seemed like the U.S.-Mexico relationship was going to be a priority. Then, of course, the war in Iraq intensified. President Obama visited Mexico, and it also seemed like that was going to be another sort of turning point, perhaps for the better, in the U.S.-Mexico relationship. And then the pivot to Asia came, right? It seemed like the administration defined Asia as a more priority region. So, yes, I think Mexico could. It's ugly to say it, but it is a second-tier ally. I think probably for the U.S. government as well as the U.S. American people, right? I will say also, though, I think maybe that's part of just an effect of living in a unipolar world. In some sense, all countries are second-tier allies for the United States, right? There's second tier to second tier. So within second tier, there's clearly sort of a hierarchy. But it seems like there are many countries that claim a sort of special relationship with the United States, Canada, Great Britain. Just a brief story with my son. He's 12, and he's starting to talk about this stuff. He said, "Dad, is it true that the U.S. and France and Great Britain declared war on Syria?" And I said, "Well, they didn't declare war, but they're bombing it." And so wait, so why is the U.S. doing this? If they attacked France, this was after the terrorist attacks in Paris, and I said, well, it's because France is an ally of the U.S. And he said, well, what's an ally? And I said, well, an ally is they attack, your allied country, your friend, and you go and you defend your friend. And he said, well, why does the U.S. need France as an ally? They said, well, that's a really good question. So in some sense, the asymmetry between the U.S. and really almost every other country in the world, I think it's especially going to affect a relationship like Mexico. But as an American living in Mexico, I would like to see Mexico as a greater priority for the U.S. But I don't know what it would take for that to happen. The Obama effect. Sophia from Arizona PBS. Yeah. I'm curious to know why Arizona. I guess probably every PBS has a bureau chief. Yeah. So you had asked, I think, about the Obama effect. And we see it, I think, for example, in this slide where, the U.S. is that top green, the sort of dark forest green line. And I don't, it's an Obama effect. Clearly, it's related to Obama's popularity among Mexicans. Part of that popularity, I think, there was a contrast to George W. Bush's unpopularity. If we go back and look at when we did this survey from 2004, 2006, and 2008, he was one of the lowest ranked leaders in the world. And it's interesting, though, because it seems like there's a sort of lagged effect between George W. Bush's unpopularity, and then it sort of drags the U.S. down over time. So I would say almost in a parallel way as the U.S. public itself soured on the Iraq War once it became clear that it was a long, drawn-out process with a lot of ups and downs and not the sort of mission accomplished that it was purported to be in 2004. I think that Mexican public opinion underwent sort of a similar process, right? You could see it really tanks between 2006 and 2008, reaches its nadir in 2008 with the economic crisis. I think that's playing in too. So it goes back up with Obama, and I think that's clearly related to his personal popularity among Mexicans. There's also, you can see one of the other slides, where trust in the U.S. goes up, and now for the first time, I think, we can take a look at the slide. There, really for the first time since we've done the poll, and that's been going on every 2 years since 2004. 2014 was the first year where more Mexicans trusted the U.S. than distrusted it. So that's part of it too. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, okay. Now the interesting thing though is that the Obama effect, there's a caveat, right? And the Obama effect appears to apply less to Mexicans who are irregular, undocumented migrants in the U.S. So if you're living there without papers, without migratory documents, that's this last slide here, the Obama meter. Your rating of Obama goes down a little bit, although it's not really a statistically significant difference. That's that last on the right-hand side. It's the lowest green bar as opposed to the gray bar. So the Obama effect isn't there for the irregular migrants.
Great. If I may make one more comment, there's some data that you didn't actually put up on the screen, but about Mexican attitudes towards foreign investment, which I think are fascinating, and we see this shift over time. But the one that remains more or less constant is that Mexicans don't like investment in their oil sector, even after the reform. Yeah. I mean, that's a we talked about how once peacekeeping was authorized, that Mexicans said, okay, fine. But with investment in the oil sector, they still don't seem to like it, because the numbers in 2014 were 30% said, yes, we'd like to, we accept that. Yeah. Whereas,
Foreign investment.
Foreign investment, yes, sorry. Now, in 2008, which was the low point, 2006 was 20%, less than 20%. And that's, that's always the figure that I pull out in my presentations when people say, how do Mexicans feel about the oil reform? And, but it's amazing, I think it's fascinating that it hasn't actually moved that much. Whereas when you look at the figures for investment in the telecommunications sector, mass media, electricity, they're considerably higher, yes. Still not overwhelmingly in favor. So Mexicans are quite nationalistic in terms of their economic sectors, in terms of foreign investment. Do you see that as part of the story here? That in general, in theory, opening up to the world is a good thing. When it comes down to brass tacks,
and it happens not only in foreign investment. I mean, when you see, I would say it this way. In general terms, people, Mexicans, and that happens also for Latin America, let me say that. In general terms, they are very open to the war. But when you ask more specific policies, programs, actions, like or the investment in different sectors, then the support is not that great. And actually, we have done some, let's say, experimental design in order to do that. You want
Sure.
to comment that?
Sure. This is a great question. It's kind of a survey phenomenon in general. It's like people hated Obamacare, but they liked a lot of the specific components of Obamacare, right? They liked, the no pre-existing conditions. They like being on your parents' policy till you're 25. They liked, right? So what we're seeing is kind of the opposite here. Like you like foreign investment, right? But and you even like it in some specific sectors. I think we asked about 4 sectors, and there was surprisingly the opposition just wasn't there to foreign investment in the newspaper, so the news industry, right? It was there in the energy sector in general, and specifically in oil. So oil is kind of like the last readout of Mexican nationalism. And my sense is that it's still there, and there's just kind of maybe this idea that in theory it would be good, but that in practice it's going to be carried out to the benefit of kind of a small number of politically well-connected people. So the experiment that Gerardo's talking about is we mentioned foreign investment, just sort of in general neutral terms. Then we had part of it where we mentioned some of the advantages of foreign investment. So it creates jobs, and then we had another where we mentioned the disadvantages of foreign investment. So it repatriates capital, it creates competition for local industries. And the interesting thing is that if you mention the advantages or the disadvantages, or the advantages and disadvantages simultaneously, all of those resulted in lower support for foreign investment and compared to just this neutral mention of do you like foreign, and we think that's because if you get people stimulate sort of thought and reflection on something, people if they're thinking only theoretically only about the advantages, they start thinking about sort of the whole ramifications, all the ramifications, and so. Once you start, getting into the specifics, support goes down in general.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Andrea.
Andrea Tanco from the Mexico Institute. I was wondering, your question of trust and how the Mexican public trusted more the U.S. government than their own politicians and the police. In terms of methodology, and this was like a face-to-face survey, trust is a very I guess, subjective term. And also, I was wondering if this perception would change if you were asking Mexicans specifically in terms of migration, security, and economy. So if you can elaborate a little bit on what went on in this question, or what was the reaction of the people that were surveyed, and if you think that this impression would change if you were wording the question different.
If we were to ask about specific Mexican government policies, or what, I'm not quite sure I
Well,
understood.
where people said that they trusted the government of the U.S.
Oh, the U.S., yeah.
more than their own president
Right.
and their politicians. I think, my question would be if this would have been different if you had asked about a specific areas like security, energy, migration, and also what was the reaction of the interviewees when you were, or the people that were surveyed? Because trust is very subjective. So what do we mean by trust in your question, I guess, also?
Oh, great. That's a methodological and theoretical. I mean, there's hundreds of articles and philosophical question about what is the meaning of trust. I mean, and we have done some about how to answer this. There is not one specific definition of trust. Let me say it this way. We really don't know exactly what is the meaning for people of trust, right? Because we ask, like, usted confía cuánto, how much do you trust these different institutions, and we cannot go into the people's head and see exactly, well, the meaning, or the heart, what the meaning of trust. There is different, perhaps different meanings. But that is, and I've been thinking about a lot, because I like actually this topic about the institutional or the political trust, and combined with the interest or the political efficacy of people, whether they put themselves in terms of the political order or that. That's a personal interest. But the thing is, when you see the results and the correlates of these questions with some other things, then trust really matters. So we don't know exactly, or at least I don't know exactly what is the meaning of what is expression, what is behind people think about. But the thing is that really you see differences when people trust or distrust or not trust a lot these institutions. And if I may just make a comment on other project we have, we are working on local human rights organizations in Mexico, and donations to these human rights organizations. And I don't know exactly the causal mechanisms behind that, but exactly the better predictor of donation is trust. I mean, if people trust these organizations, whatever that means, they will give money. For instance, I don't know if that answered. I mean, not exactly the meaning, but the consequence of that is really important. Whether that would be different if we, I don't know how to ask the question of trust on policies, not in institutions. I haven't seen actually that that result. That would be interesting, but we haven't done that, and no people have
Not
done
US
actually.
policies.
Exactly,
no.
not US policies. Yes.
Some parts of it.
Yes.
This is a great question, Andre. This actually really goes to the heart of what we do as survey researchers. So it's true that trust is a subjective concept, but I guess that's kind of the point, really, right? So is that we know that it's a good thing to trust. We know that because it correlates with other good things like admiration, and we also know that it's meaningful, whatever's in there, whatever the content is. And I think it's just generally a feeling that that these institutions are going to do the right thing, right? That they're going to somehow represent your interests well. And we know that because it's correlated with other positive things, and that it can be predicted by things like education. So we know that by comparing it to other variables that it has a real and meaningful content, that it can be predicted by other things, and it in turn predicts other things. Now, the other interesting thing, though, is that whatever trust means, it's going to mean about the same thing for the church as it does for, so whatever it does mean, and even if this meaning varies a little bit from individual to individual, that there are these consistent rank orders. And by the way, these rank orders are pretty consistent across countries. Politicians are always the worst in every country, and religious institutions are always the best. And then I guess another thing I would say about this is that that there is a difference between, I think if we were to ask about specific policies of the U.S. government, we do. For example, we ask about, has the U.S. government made it harder for people to get in? Clearly, if once you sort of delve into the specifics, and I think this gets back to Duncan's question that he asked a few minutes ago, right? About foreign investment as opposed to foreign investment in specific sectors. Once you delve into the specifics, it always gets a little less positive, right? But and I've become a big believer typically survey researchers, you design the questionnaire, you farm it out, and you get the database back at the end. And I've become a big believer of trying to find out what goes on in the middle of that, right? So we've started going out with Pablo's crew to pilot the survey and just see some of the reactions. And there are some of the questions that are a little difficult to understand, some of the more but the trust, I've never observed, and we've done this survey in Latin America, we've done this as part of this human rights surveys, we've done it in India, we've done it in Nigeria, we've done it and I've just never seen that this trust question is spurs on these philosophical reflections of what does it mean to trust? Or, you're right, but for all these reasons that I think Gerardo and I have mentioned, we really like this question.
Gentlemen and ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. May I just make a request, a petition for next time around? Because we'll see you again in a year or year and a half's time, of course, because this is now a tradition. You've been here many times. Do you accept any suggestions for questions on the survey?
Yeah, absolutely.
Perhaps that would be an interesting thing. We should have a survey of what questions people would like to see on your survey. That kind of crowdsourcing may actually come to be very interesting. I, for one, given the political times, would be interested in seeing or in hearing how Mexicans see levels of corruption in other countries versus levels of corruption in Mexico. You know, there's been so much news over the past couple of years about Brazil and Guatemala. Similarly, for violence levels, you know, working here at the Mexico Institute, we're constantly reminding people that Mexico is not the most violent country in the hemisphere. Do Mexicans recognize that? I wonder would be an interesting thing. And lastly, and you may already have this data, but how many people in Mexico speak or claim they speak a foreign language? And the English thing, you have that one already. That would be really interesting to see that alongside the overall figures. Like, are English speakers in Mexico or people who speak one foreign language more likely to be friendly to the world than those who don't?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We do have information on foreign language, and of course, the vast majority of foreign language speakers is English and Mexican. I think it's about what, 15 or 17%? Is it that high? 12?
It's
Don't remember the figure at all.
15%.
But these are people with an internationalist orientation, people who are interested about what's going on in other countries in the world, people who do want Mexico to play an active role in foreign affairs. So yeah, that's a great question. And yes, we do have that information, and yes, it turns out to be highly correlated with this kind of citizen of the world, cosmopolitan identity. Yeah.
Gerardo, David, and of course Danny, thank you very much for being here today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.